So pivot table facts and data attributes. There is some information it's important to understand about the way you set up your data when you're creating a pivot table. We're going to talk about those things. And then we're also going to talk about some pivot table facts that are important to understand as well if you're going to use pivot tables effectively. So I've got a worksheet with a copy of the data that we used in the last movie, and I'm going to contrast that with the bad data that's on the worksheet as we go through the list of the data attributes that are important to pay attention to when you're structuring data in anticipation of using it to build a pivot table with. Beginning with each column is a unique field. That's true in the good data. We have month, salesperson, division, sales dollars, sales quantity. Where in the bad data, we have division listed 3 times. What we want is for each one of the columns to contain a field value that's unique. And when we label that field, we want the column header to be in one cell. Because in the bad data, in the case of salesperson, the cell below sales is going to be considered by Excel to be the first row of data. Third, each row is a separate record. Each row is a complete record. So in row 5, we have in the month of June, the salesperson Rob that works in Division 3 had sales of $416 of product that totaled 48 units. That's one complete record. 4, if the column contains numerical data, don't allow blank cells, use a 0 instead. That's basically because you'll cause yourself an issue because one blank cell causes a pivot table to count rather than sum. You can fix that after the fact, but it's nice not to have to do that. Number 6, don't use blank rows or blank columns. We've got a blank column in the bad data. It's important that the data is in a contiguous data range. 7, remove totals and subtotals from the data. The bad data has 2 grand totals, and if you think about it, that's exactly the information we're trying to derive by creating the pivot table. If we have data that's already aggregated, it, granted, may not be aggregated in the way that we want it to be aggregated, but the whole point of the pivot table is to provide those aggregations that we do want. So if you have totals and subtotals embedded within your data, you need to take them out. 8, and this is just a suggestion, it's optional. If you have data that you add to your data set on a regular basis, change the data region to a table, because it will dynamically redefine itself, including that new data, and your pivot table will reference that data in its entirety if it's defined within a table, and it'll include all of it every time you refresh your pivot table. And 9, double-click to get a separate worksheet showing the data making up that cell in the pivot table. Hang on to that for a second, because I'm going to create a pivot table before the end of this movie, and we're going to do that. And again, that's not really a data attribute. That's just something it's good to know, and you can sort of complete the circle with beginning with your data, running it through a pivot table, double-clicking the cell, and getting that data presented back to you, at least the data that makes up the value for that cell. So on to relevant facts. The first one, maybe the most important one, the pivot table creates a cache file so that changes to the data are not reflected in the pivot table until you refresh the pivot table. So if I select a cell in the data region and go to the Insert tab, left-click Pivot Table, and create a pivot table on the existing worksheet, I'm going to scroll up a little bit and move that dialog box. Right here in cell Q19, and left-click OK, I get my pivot table. And I'm going to quickly create a pivot table summarizing the sales by month. And when I go back to the data, press the Shift key, press N down arrow, and then the Delete key, there are no changes to my pivot table because, as I said, the pivot table is referencing a cache file, which is a copy of the data, basically. And in order to get the pivot table to refresh, we have to refresh it by selecting it, going to Options, and left-clicking Refresh. And now my values disappear because there are no values in the data. So I'm going to Control Z to get those numbers back to the pivot table, Control Z again to undo my deletion of the sales data. And going back up to the data attributes number 9, if I select one of these cells and double click it, Excel will create a worksheet that lists the data that summarizes to the value in that cell. And in this case, it's all the sales for the salesperson, Jimmy. Going back to the movie content, the fact that the pivot table is working off of a cache file leads us to number 2 in the relevant facts, and that is, if you plan on building several pivot tables from the same data, copy the pivot table and make changes to the pivot table, otherwise you create another cache file. That's not that big of a deal if you don't have a lot of data. But if your data is fairly large, it's 100,000 rows, for instance, every time you create a pivot table off of that data, you create another cache file or another copy of that data, and you can bulk up your spreadsheet pretty quickly by doing that. So what you want to do is select the pivot table, and we have it selected. Go to the Actions group, left-click select the entire pivot table, Control-C to copy, select a new location, and Control-V, and I've created a copy of the pivot table. And these function independent of one another, although they're deriving their content from the same cache file. And although we haven't talked about filtering yet, I'm going to do some filtering where I'm going to have the first pivot table show the sales for Jimmy, and the second pivot table show the sales for Rob, to illustrate the fact that they are two independent pivot tables. Number 3 in relevant facts, to work with the pivot table tools, you need to select the pivot table. That's just a standard Excel contextual tab reality. It's true with charts, with shapes, with pictures, with smart art, and so on. If you want to work on the object, you need to select it to get the contextual tab command buttons that are relevant for that object. Number 4, you cannot change or move part of a pivot table or insert cells in a pivot table. If I were to select half of the cells that make up this pivot table, Control X to cut and move them over, or attempt to move them over one column and enter, I'm going to get an error message telling me I cannot move part of a pivot table report or insert worksheet cells, rows, columns, etc. So the pivot table is an entity that is sort of self-contained. And that's why, number 5, you can't insert a column or row within the pivot table. So when I attempt to do that, again, I get that error message back. So finally, number 6, when you format, don't format the cell, format the pivot table. And although you'll be able to format the cell because you can right-click and get the shortcut menu, and with the mini toolbar, I can put a yellow fill in there. But when I go to refresh the pivot table, going to Options and Refresh and have it rewrite, the pivot table writes itself over the formatting in those cells. Now there's an option choice that you can make that not happen, but there are better ways to format the pivot table where you're actually formatting the pivot table itself as opposed to the cells that contain the pivot table. And we'll get into all of that in another movie as well. So that's the data attributes and the relevant pivot table facts. We went through a number of data attributes that are important to pay attention to when you're setting up your data that you're going to use to create a pivot table with. The columns need to be a unique field with a one-cell heading, with each row containing a separate record. If the column contains numerical data, make sure that it doesn't contain any blank cells, because the pivot table will aggregate that field value as a count instead of a sum. Don't allow any blank rows or columns. It needs to be a contiguous data set. Remove all totals, subtotals from the data. And if you expand your data on a regular basis, convert it to a table. And once you get your pivot table drawn, you can double-click one of the cells, and Excel will present to you the portion of the data that makes up the value for that particular cell. As far as the pivot table itself goes, understand that the pivot table doesn't work off the data directly. There's a cache file, which is a copy of the data. Since that's the case, you need to refresh the pivot table for any changes in your data. And if you have a lot of data, make a copy of the pivot table as opposed to creating another one. Otherwise, every time you create another one, you create another cache file. Select the pivot table to get the pivot table tool's contextual tabs. The pivot table is a self-contained object, so you can't change or move part of the pivot table or insert columns or rows. And when you format items on the pivot table, don't format the cells. You actually have to format the pivot table itself.